The knife was still in my hand when Marcus told the judges I had stolen his recipe. We were standing under the competition lights at the State Culinary Championship, cameras rolling, my station covered in shallot skins and a half-reduced wine sauce. And he said it loud enough for the front row to hear. He said, "This dish, the seared duck with the cherry gastrique, this was his idea from 3 years ago, and I took it and put my name on it." The head judge, a stiff woman named Carol Iverson, turned to me with her pen hovering over the scorecard, and behind her, a boom mic dipped lower, catching every word. The room went quiet in that particular way. A room goes quiet when 200 people decide at once to stop pretending they are not listening. My hands did not shake. I want to be clear about that, because everyone assumes your hands shake in a moment like this. But mine were steady, plating the duck, spooning the gastrique in a slow arc, because I had made this dish 400 times in our kitchen, and my body knew what to do even when my head was screaming. Marcus stood there in his white coat with his arms crossed, and behind him, tucked at the edge of the competitors' area, was Renata, his sister, filming on her phone, angling the shot so it would catch my face and not his. Carol asked, "Owen, do you have a response to this?" And I said, "I have been making this exact reduction since before Marcus and I even signed our lease. Ask him what year we opened." And Marcus said, "Opening a restaurant together doesn't erase who came up with what first." And Carol said, "This isn't a debate stage, gentlemen. I need something concrete." I asked Marcus in front of everyone when exactly he claimed to have written that page, and he said 3 years ago. And I said, "Then why does the ink look fresh?" And Carol, without saying anything, turned the notebook toward the light for a moment before setting it back down, her expression unreadable. Marcus reached into his jacket and produced a spiral notebook with cherry gastrique written on the cover, in handwriting that was not mine, and was not his either, flipped it open to a page dated 3 years earlier, and said, "Here, dated, in my own hand, before this dish ever touched his menu." Carol took the notebook, studied the page for a long moment, and I felt my whole career tilt sideways, watching a stranger decide, based on a few lines of ink, whether the last 6 years of my life had been a lie. Somewhere behind the judge's table, another competitor, a woman named Farah, who I barely knew from a rival restaurant across town, had stopped plating entirely and was just staring, her own timer counting down unattended. A production assistant with a clipboard kept glancing at Jill Anders for direction, unsure whether to keep the wide shot or push in for my face, and I could feel the exact moment the camera operator chose the close-up, because the red light on top of the camera swung directly toward me and stayed there. My duck was going cold under the heat lamp. I remember thinking, absurdly, in the middle of everything, that the gastrique would break if it sat much longer, that 6 years of technique were about to be judged less on flavor than on whether a stranger believed a story about ink on paper, and something about that thought, how small and stupid it was, how much it did not matter compared to what was actually happening, is what finally let me breathe again. I had been business partners with Marcus Doyle for 6 years. We opened Bryson Doyle together in a strip mall unit that used to be a dry cleaner, and I mopped that floor myself the week before we opened because we could not afford a cleaning crew. And I remembered him standing in that empty space with a tape measure, arguing with me about where the pass should go. And I remembered thinking, this guy cares as much as I do. This is someone I can build something with. I need you to understand what 6 years with Marcus actually looked like, because the notebook was only the last of a long list of small betrayals I had been too tired or too loyal to notice. There was the time in our second year when a food blogger wanted to profile the restaurant, and Marcus told her the tasting menu was entirely his concept, and I let it go because we needed the press, and I told myself partners share credit. That is what partners do. There was the time our lease renewal fell through the way we expected, and I later found, by accident, in a shared drive, a side letter Marcus had quietly signed with our landlord, giving himself first right to buy out my share if the restaurant ever failed. And when I confronted him, he laughed and called it a technicality, just paperwork, nothing that would ever matter. There was the night we won a regional award for Best New Restaurant, and the local paper ran a photo of Marcus alone at the podium because, he told me afterward, the reporter had only asked for one interview, and he assumed I would not mind. There was his mother, Diane, who never once said my name at a family dinner without adding, but, of course, Marcus is the real talent, as if I were the guy who just held the door open for 6 years. And there was Renata, who worked the front of house and had a habit of seating our worst tables with our best customers whenever I had personally recommended something. So the compliments always seemed to land on the kitchen in general, and never on me specifically. There was the anniversary dinner in our 4th year, when Marcus stood up in front of the whole staff, raised a glass, and thanked by name every investor, every vendor, and his own mother, without once mentioning that I had personally cooked every service that month while he was traveling to visit a college friend in Denver. And when I brought it up privately afterward, he said he simply forgot, the way people forget small things. And I let that word, small, sit in my chest without arguing, because arguing felt exhausting, and because some part of me still believed the restaurant mattered more than my own name on a toast. I remember standing in the walk-in cooler after that dinner, alone, counting inventory I did not actually need to count, just to have a reason to be somewhere quiet for 10 minutes, and thinking that if I ever opened another place, I would make sure nobody who worked their hands raw for it ever had to go looking for a cooler to feel seen in. There was also the time a line cook quit without notice on a Friday night, and Marcus told the remaining staff it was because I had been too hard on him during service. When the truth, which I only learned a year later from Priya, was that the cook had quit because Marcus refused to pay him for 2 weeks of overtime, and Marcus had simply needed a story that put the blame somewhere else. There was one more, smaller than the rest, but the one that stuck with me longest. A Sunday morning when I brought in a hand-drawn menu concept for a spring tasting series, pages of notes, wine pairings, plating sketches I had worked on for weeks. And Marcus flipped through it in about 90 seconds, said it needed work, and 2 months later presented an almost identical concept to a supplier rep as his own idea for the season, using 3 of my exact dish names without changing a word. And when I pointed it out privately, he told me great chefs steal from themselves all the time, as if borrowing from me was somehow the same as borrowing from himself. I told myself none of it mattered because the food was good and the restaurant was surviving, and surviving in that first grinding stretch felt like winning. What I did not tell Marcus, what I had not told anyone except my wife Callie, was that 8 months earlier, a food technology company out of Chicago called Halden Foods had reached out to me directly. Not to the restaurant, to me, because they had tasted the cherry gastrique at a regional trade show where I had cooked solo, a booking Marcus had skipped because he called trade shows a waste of a Saturday. Halden wanted to license the reduction process, the actual technique I had spent 2 years refining on my own time in our home kitchen, long before Marcus and I ever discussed cherry anything, back when we were still arguing about whether the restaurant should even have a tasting menu. I had filed for a provisional patent on the reduction method using my own money and my own lawyer, a careful, unhurried woman named Priscilla Wren, who told me to keep every draft and every dated note I had ever made, because provisional filings only hold their priority date if you can later prove the work was genuinely yours, independently developed, on your own time. And I remembered sitting across from her in a small office lined with case binders, while she asked me, almost gently, whether anyone else had contributed even a single idea to the reduction technique. And I said no. And she said, "Good, then we build the file around that. Dated notebooks, timestamp photographs of the sauce reducing on my own stovetop, receipts for the specific cherries I sourced from a small orchard 2 counties over." I signed the licensing agreement quietly in March. Nobody at Bryson Doyle knew. Not Marcus, not Renata, not even the sous chefs who worked the line with me every night. I was not hiding it out of spite. I was hiding it because some instinct I did not fully trust myself yet had already started warning me about what Marcus would do if he found out I had something that was entirely, provably mine, something that did not need his name attached to be worth anything. He organized the whole thing to happen at the championship on purpose. I understood that later, because a regional broadcast crew was covering the finals for a Food Network special, and Marcus had spent 2 weeks quietly courting a producer named Jill Anders, telling her there was a great story here about a business partner exposing fraud live on camera, and Jill, hungry for drama, had agreed to keep her cameras rolling no matter what happened at my station. In the moment, all I knew was that Carol Iverson was still holding that notebook, and the room was still waiting, and I said, "That is not my handwriting, and it is not Marcus's handwriting either." And someone should ask whose it is. And Marcus said, "Are you seriously accusing my sister of forging evidence right now in front of everyone?" And I said, "I did not say Renata's name, you did," and for the first time all afternoon, I watched something crack across his face, a half second of a man realizing he had said more than he meant to. Carol said she would need to suspend my scoring pending review, and asked me to step away from my station, and I did. Because arguing on camera with a half-finished duck breast still resting under foil was not going to save anything. Marcus smiled at me as I walked past him, the same easy smile I had seen across 1,000 plating stations, and said, "Nothing personal," and I said, "It is extremely personal, Marcus," and kept walking, because I was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching me come apart in front of 200 strangers and a camera crew that wanted exactly that shot for their evening broadcast. Marcus was not finished, though, because a public accusation only works if it keeps growing. And 3 days later, he called an all-staff meeting at the restaurant, invited 2 local reporters, and stood in the dining room in front of our own employees to announce that he was terminating our partnership agreement effective immediately, citing what he called a documented pattern of intellectual property theft. He had prepared a printed statement, 3 pages, stapled, and he read it like he had rehearsed it in a mirror, which he probably had. I sat at table 12, the corner table Renata always gave to regulars who tipped badly, and I listened to him describe me. In front of a line cook named Theo, who I had personally trained for 2 years, and a hostess named Priya, who used to bring me coffee on double shifts because she knew I forgot to eat, as a man who built his career on borrowed ideas. Theo would not look at me. Priya kept glancing over like she wanted to say something and could not find the words. When Marcus finished, he took questions, and a reporter from the local paper asked if there was any documentation beyond the notebook. And Marcus said his legal team was compiling a full file, and that he expected it to be, in his words, thorough and damning. A second reporter asked whether the restaurant's name would change, and Marcus said Bryson Doyle would simply become Doyle's. A clean break, he called it. And I watched Priya flinch at that, because she had been the one who painted the sign out front 2 years earlier, and had always been proud of the way both our names sat side by side over the door. Theo raised his hand at one point, the only staff member who did, and asked Marcus directly whether Owen would be given a chance to respond before any legal filing went public. And Marcus said this was not a debate, Theo. This is a business decision. And Theo sat back down slowly, and I saw him glance at me once, just once, in a way that told me he did not believe a word of what he had just heard. Marcus folded his statement and said one more thing before he sat down, that he would be filing a formal claim against any outside patent application connected to recipes developed during our partnership, because legal counsel had informed him that anything developed while we were partners, in his words, belonged equally to Bryson Doyle, regardless of whose name was on it. That was the moment I understood he already knew about Halden Foods. He had known for weeks. I would later learn it was our accountant, a man named Roy Finch, who Marcus paid extra under the table to flag anything unusual in the business accounts, and my licensing deposit, wired to a personal account I thought was private, had shown up on a routine audit Roy ran without my knowledge, and Roy had simply forwarded the wire details to Marcus in an email with the subject line, "Thought you should see this." Marcus had not staged the cherry gastrique accusation because he thought I stole a recipe. He staged it because he wanted to publicly discredit me before I could publicly announce a licensing deal that would have made me, not him, the face of everything we had built. I want to pause the restaurant story for a minute, because something else was happening at home during those 2 weeks that had nothing to do with Marcus, and it mattered more than I understood at the time. Our daughter, Nora, had a school project due, a family tree with photographs, and she asked me one night at the kitchen table why there were no pictures of me smiling from work, only pictures of me smiling at home. And I did not have a good answer for her, because I realized I had not smiled at that restaurant in longer than I wanted to admit. Callie found me in the garage that same night, sitting on an overturned bucket, not doing anything, just sitting. And she did not ask me what was wrong. She just sat down on the concrete next to me and waited until I was ready to talk. I told her, for the first time out loud, that I thought Marcus had known about Halden before the championship, that the notebook had felt too convenient, too rehearsed. And Callie asked me a question I had been avoiding. She asked, "What do you actually want out of this? Do you want to save the partnership or do you want out?" And I sat with that question for a long time before I answered. And when I finally said the words out loud, "I want out," something in my chest loosened that had been tight for years. Callie did not tell me I was right or wrong. She told me she would support whatever I decided. And then she said something practical. She said, "If you think he already knows about the deal, you need your own lawyer in the room before anything else happens. Not just for the patent, for everything." And that conversation in the garage, more than anything Marcus did on that stage, is what made me call Priscilla Wren the next morning and ask her to represent me fully, not just on the licensing side, and to start quietly documenting everything. That same week, almost as a footnote, Callie mentioned something she had noticed months earlier and never brought up because at the time it had not seemed important. She worked part-time doing the books for a bakery 2 blocks from Bryson Doyle, the same bakery whose upstairs office I would eventually rent, and she said the bakery owner had mentioned, in passing, that Roy Finch, our accountant, had asked her once about pulling comparable wage data for restaurant staff, framed as a routine industry benchmarking request. But the questions had felt oddly specific to Roy's usual scope of work, more curious about who among the Bryson Doyle staff might be unhappy than about actual wage numbers. Callie had not thought much of it until now, sitting on the garage floor, and she said it out loud almost apologetically, like she was not sure it mattered. But Priscilla, when I repeated it to her the next morning, wrote it down without comment and said, "Everything matters right now. Write down every strange thing anyone tells you this month, no matter how small it seems, because patterns only become visible once you have enough points to connect." I did not know yet how right she would turn out to be. 2 weeks after the staff meeting, Marcus organized what he called a partnership dissolution dinner, framed to the press as a graceful mutual parting of ways, though nothing about it was mutual and nothing about it was graceful. He booked a private room at a hotel downtown, the kind with heavy curtains and a fireplace that never seemed to actually get lit, and he invited food writers, 2 city council members who had helped us get our original permits, and, strangely, Carol Iverson herself, whom he had been quietly cultivating since the championship with a series of what he called goodwill gestures, a bottle of wine here, a reserved table there. He wanted an audience for what he planned to say, which was that he would be buying out my share of the restaurant at a valuation his own lawyer had calculated, a number so low it would have covered maybe 8 months of my mortgage. And Priscilla had already warned me, days before the dinner, that this kind of number usually meant Marcus expected me to simply accept it out of exhaustion rather than negotiate, because exhausted people rarely fight hard for a fair price. I almost did not go. Callie told me I did not owe him the dignity of showing up, and she was right. But I went anyway, because I had learned by then that Marcus needed an audience to feel powerful, and I was not going to hand him an empty room, and because Priscilla had quietly suggested I bring her along as my counsel, seated at the table rather than waiting outside, a small detail Marcus did not object to when I mentioned it, which told me he still did not fully understand how much had already shifted underneath him. What none of us expected, not Marcus, not Renata, not even me walking in that night, was that the dinner would be interrupted 40 minutes in, right after the appetizer course, by my old sous chef Theo, who stood up from his seat near the kitchen door and asked if he could say something. And Marcus, thinking Theo was about to publicly reaffirm his loyalty, said, "Of course, go ahead. This is exactly the kind of transparency we should have had from the start." Theo held up his phone and said he wanted to play something he had recorded 3 weeks earlier, back when Marcus asked him to help move some boxes out of the old storage unit behind the restaurant. And Theo had, almost by accident, left his phone recording in his apron pocket during a conversation between Marcus and Renata that neither of them realized anyone could hear. The recording was 12 minutes long, and Carol asked Theo to play it from the beginning rather than a clip, saying she wanted the full context, not a highlight reel, and Theo obliged. In the first minute, Marcus's voice, unmistakable, tinny through the phone speaker but perfectly clear, said, "The handwriting has to be close enough to pass, but different enough that nobody can prove it's yours." And Renata's voice answered, "I already practiced it 40 times. Relax." And Marcus said, "Once Iverson suspends him on camera, it doesn't even matter what happens after. The footage is the story." A food writer near the head of the table set down her pen. Around the 4-minute mark, Renata asked whether they needed a witness who could back up the notebook date if anyone challenged it, and Marcus said Roy could vouch for the timeline since he handled the books anyway. And at that, Carol Iverson looked directly at me for the first time since the recording started. And I understood she was connecting Roy Finch's name to the audit line item Priscilla had already flagged for her 2 days earlier, in a quiet, separate email neither Marcus nor I had mentioned at the table. Around the 7-minute mark came the sentence that ended everything, Marcus said. "The patent thing is the real problem. If Halden finds out he filed before the partnership dispute is public, we lose our claim entirely, so we need the fraud story out first." And Renata laughed and said something about how easy it had all been. Marcus stood up so fast his chair fell backward and said the recording was doctored, taken out of context, illegally obtained, a whole list of words lawyers use when they are drowning. And Priscilla, sitting quietly 2 seats down from me, said calmly, "Marcus, I would be careful about characterizing evidence as fabricated in front of an ethics committee chair and 2 members of city council. That is a claim you will need to prove, not just state." Renata tried to leave the room and found Priya, of all people, standing quietly in the doorway with her own phone raised. Because Priya, it turned out, had been suspicious of Renata for over a year, ever since a night when she overheard Renata on a phone call in the walk-in cooler, saying something about making sure the credit for the tasting menu went where it belonged, and Priya had simply been waiting for a reason to believe her own instincts. Carol asked Theo, in front of everyone, whether he would be willing to provide the full recording to the championship's ethics committee. And Theo said yes, he already had 3 days earlier, along with a written statement, because he had not wanted to blindside anyone at the table without giving the proper people a chance to review it first. Priya then spoke up on her own, unprompted, and said she wanted to give her own account for the record. And Carol nodded and asked her to go ahead. Priya described calmly and without exaggeration 3 separate incidents over the past year where Renata had steered food critics and regular customers away from tables where I was working the pass, specifically toward Marcus. And one particular night, documented in the restaurant's own reservation software, with timestamps Priya still had access to, where a well-known critic had been rebooked twice in one evening to avoid being seated during my service window. Marcus tried to interrupt, saying reservation logistics were not evidence of anything. And Carol cut him off, saying, "Marcus, you had your turn to speak 20 minutes ago. Right now I am listening to the people who actually worked in that kitchen." Priscilla then produced, calmly, without raising her voice, a single page from her folder, a forwarded email chain she had obtained through a records request tied to my own patent filing, showing Roy Finch forwarding my private wire transfer details to Marcus's personal account 3 weeks before the championship, with a subject line that read simply, "Thought you should see this." And Carol asked Roy directly, since he was seated near the back with the other staff, whether he had authorization to access those personal financial records. And Roy did not answer. He just looked at his plate. Priscilla was not finished. She laid down a second document, a printed bank statement from the restaurant's own business account, showing a transfer of $800 from Marcus to Roy the same week the wire details had been forwarded, labeled simply as a consulting fee, and asked Roy whether that payment had anything to do with the information he had shared. And this time Roy said, quietly, almost to himself, "I didn't think it would go this far." That single sentence from Theo, that he had already given his statement properly through the right channel days earlier, rather than ambushing the table, told me something about him I had never fully appreciated in 2 years of working beside him. That he did things properly even when properly was the harder, slower, less satisfying path, and it made the whole unraveling feel less like revenge and more like the truth simply catching up to where it always should have been. The room itself changed in a way I had never seen a room change before. 20 minutes earlier, half the table had been nodding along politely, while Marcus talked about graceful transitions and mutual decisions, the food writers jotting notes, the council members making the kind of neutral small talk people make when they assume they already know how an evening will end. By the time Priya finished describing the reservation logs, one of the food writers had quietly closed her notebook on Marcus's version of events entirely and started a fresh page, and I watched her write my name at the top of it instead. A woman I did not recognize, someone's plus one seated near the end of the table, leaned over to her neighbor and whispered something. And the neighbor nodded and looked at Marcus the way you look at someone you have just realized you have been wrong about for an entire evening. Even the restaurant staff who had come to serve the courses started moving differently, slower, more deliberately, finding reasons to linger near our end of the table instead of rushing back to the kitchen, because nobody wants to miss the moment a room decides, all at once, who the villain actually is. Carol Iverson did not raise her voice once through any of it, but when she finally spoke again, asking Marcus if he had anything further to add, her tone had shifted from the careful neutrality of a judge to something closer to a woman who had simply run out of patience for a story that no longer held together. And Marcus, for the first time all night, did not have an answer ready. A waiter who had been quietly clearing the appetizer plates paused near the kitchen door, tray balanced on one hand, clearly listening. And I caught his eye for half a second, and he gave me the smallest nod, the kind of nod a stranger gives you when they have just decided, privately, which side of a story they believe. The fallout did not happen all at once, and I am glad it did not because I got to watch it happen in pieces. And each piece landed with its own particular weight. Carol Iverson's ethics committee disqualified Marcus's team retroactively from the championship and issued a public statement 3 weeks later confirming that the notebook evidence had been fabricated, which meant every outlet that had run the original story about a chef caught stealing recipes had to run a correction. And corrections, unlike accusations, rarely make the evening news, but they mattered enormously to me because my name was attached to both. Halden Foods, once they learned the full timeline, did not walk away from our deal. They accelerated it because a legal team that had been quietly nervous about a partnership dispute muddying the patent's origin story suddenly had a recorded conversation and a documented email chain proving the origin story was mine and only mine, clean and unclouded. And they pushed the licensing agreement through ahead of schedule with an increased advance because publicity, even messy publicity, made the sauce a story people wanted to license. The city council members who had been at that dinner quietly withdrew their support for a small business grant Marcus had been counting on to expand a second location, not through any formal statement, just through the slow administrative silence that happens when two officials decide privately they want nothing more to do with a name. Our accountant, Roy Finch, lost his license after a state board investigation found he had accessed my personal financial records without authorization and shared them with a business partner who did not have legal standing to request them. And I felt strangely little satisfaction about that one, mostly just tired. I did hear, secondhand from Priscilla, that Roy sent a short written apology to the board acknowledging what he had done and that he had taken a job doing basic bookkeeping for a hardware store across town, a smaller life than the one he had built for himself. And I did not feel triumphant about that either. Just a kind of quiet confirmation that consequences, when they finally arrive, rarely look like fireworks. They look like a man filling out paperwork at a smaller desk. Priscilla also mentioned, almost in passing, that the state board's written findings specifically noted a pattern rather than a single lapse, citing at least 2 other clients whose records Roy had accessed beyond his authorization over the years, which told me my situation had not been some unique cruelty aimed only at me, just the latest example of a man who had never quite learned where the line was. Renata was let go from her front-of-house job at a different restaurant 2 months later, after word spread through the small, gossiping world of local hospitality about the recording. And nobody in that industry, whatever else you can say about restaurant people, tends to forgive a manufactured fraud once they have heard it in someone's own voice. Marcus himself lost the lease renewal on Bryson Doyle entirely, since the landlord, reading the same news everyone else was reading, decided a fresh legal dispute was not worth the risk. And the strip mall unit that used to be a dry cleaner sat empty for months afterward, which I only know because Callie drove past it once and told me, gently, that I did not need to go see it myself. Even Jill Anders, the producer who had agreed to keep her cameras rolling no matter what happened, ended up running a very different segment than the one Marcus had promised her, a follow-up piece about manufactured evidence in competitive cooking, which aired with my name cleared, and Marcus's name mentioned only in the context of the Ethics Committee's findings. And I heard later that the network quietly declined to invite him back as a guest judge the following season, a small door closing softly somewhere I never had to see. Farah, the competitor from the rival restaurant across town, who had stood frozen at her own station the day the accusation first happened, sent me a short message a few weeks after the correction ran, saying only that she had believed something felt wrong that afternoon and was glad the truth had come out, and something about hearing it from a near stranger, someone with no reason to take a side, mattered to me more than I expected it to. Diane, Marcus's mother, called Callie directly, not me, because she said she was too embarrassed to call the number she still had saved under my name from years of holiday dinners, and asked, carefully, whether I would ever consider speaking to Marcus again. And Callie told her gently that some questions were not really hers to ask on his behalf. And Diane, to her credit, did not push. She just said she was sorry, for whatever that was worth after 6 years of never once saying my name without a qualifier attached to it. Marcus came to see me at the end of it, at my new place, a small licensing office I had rented above a bakery 2 blocks from the old restaurant. And he stood in the doorway looking smaller than I remembered him. And he said he was sorry, that things had gotten out of hand, that he had been scared about money and scared about being the partner people forgot to mention. And he asked if there was any way to rebuild something between us, even just professionally. I asked him to sit down, mostly because it felt strange to have this conversation with him standing in a doorway like a delivery driver. And he did, perching on the edge of a chair I had bought secondhand the week before. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. The 2 of us just sitting in a small room above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon, a smell that had nothing to do with either of our lives for the past 6 years. I asked him honestly whether he had planned the notebook before or after he found out about Halden, because I still wanted to know, and he admitted quietly that it had been after, that some part of him had convinced himself the accusation was almost fair, since he genuinely believed our early conversations about sauces in general had somehow entitled him to a claim on whatever came later. And hearing him say that out loud, so plainly, so without real remorse for the mechanics of it, only confirmed what I already suspected. He asked near the end whether I thought he was a bad person, and I told him I did not think that was a question I was qualified to answer, that I only knew what he had done to me, specifically, and that was enough information to make my decision without needing to judge the rest of who he was. He nodded slowly at that, the way a person nods when an answer is fair, even though it is not the one they wanted. And for a second, I almost felt sorry for him, sitting in a second-hand chair in a room that smelled like cinnamon, a long way from the man who had once stood so confidently under competition lights, holding someone else's future in his hands. I thought about the tape measure in that empty dry cleaner unit and the mopped floor and the 6 years, and I told him calmly that I did not hate him and that I was not interested in punishing him further, but that trust, once you manufacture evidence against someone, is not a thing you get to ask for back. And I asked him to leave, and he did, without arguing, which told me he had known before he knocked what the answer would be. Callie was waiting for me that evening with Nora, who had finally finished her family tree project, and taped to the poster board, right next to a photo from our wedding, was a new photograph Callie must have taken without me noticing. Me at our own kitchen counter, laughing at something, an apron still tied around my waist. Nora had written a single sentence in careful 6-year-old handwriting under the photo. It said, "My dad makes the best sauce in the world and never gives up." And I stood in the hallway looking at it for longer than I meant to, because somewhere in the last 6 years I had forgotten that the people who mattered most had never once needed a notebook or a judge or a camera to know whose work this actually was. Nora asked why Daddy did not go to the old restaurant anymore. And I told her, the way you tell a 6-year-old the truth in pieces small enough to hold, that Daddy found out some people were not being honest, and that being honest, even when it costs you something, is the only way to keep the things that matter. She thought about that for a moment, the way kids do when they are deciding whether an answer satisfies them. And then she asked if the new restaurant would have her favorite noodles on the menu. And I told her it would have whatever she wanted. And that seemed to settle the matter entirely, as if 6 years of grown-up complications could be resolved as easily as a noodle dish. We ate dinner at our own table that night. Nothing fancy, just roasted chicken and the cherry gastrique, made in our own kitchen, on our own terms. And Nora asked for seconds, and Callie reached over and took my hand under the table. And for the first time in months, I let my shoulders come all the way down. And the twist, if you want to call it that, came 4 months later when Halden Foods called to tell me the sauce line was outperforming every other product in its category launch that year, selling through faster than any comparable product they had licensed in the last 3 years. And they wanted to talk about an expanded partnership, a whole line of gastriques under my name, my face on the packaging if I wanted it, a level of attention I had never once imagined for myself back when I was reducing cherries on my own stovetop at midnight, after a full shift on the line. While I was still absorbing that, Theo called separately to ask if I would consider bringing him on as head chef for a new place. My place. No partners this time. Just an operating agreement with people I actually trusted, drafted by Priscilla, with terms so plain and so fair that Theo laughed out loud when he read it and asked if I had missed a clause somewhere. And I said yes before he finished the sentence. Then, almost as an afterthought at the end of that same phone call, Theo mentioned that Priya had quietly filed her own trademark application months earlier on a cocktail garnish technique she had developed on slow nights at the old bar station. Something small, something none of us had ever taken seriously, and that a boutique beverage company had just made her an offer of their own, which meant the two people Marcus had spent years treating as background staff were about to become his direct competitors in the same small industry he still hoped to rebuild in. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up the phone, not gloating exactly, more just quietly amazed at how much talent had been sitting in that kitchen the whole time, overlooked, underestimated, waiting for someone to simply notice. And I made a note to myself, right there in the licensing office above the bakery, that whatever I built next would never again let a person's contribution go unspoken just because they were not the one holding the microphone. We opened the new place in the spring. I think about that dry cleaner unit sometimes, the tape measure, the mop, the version of me who thought loyalty meant staying quiet. I do not think that anymore. 6 years taught me that quiet is not the same thing as kindness, and that the people who ask you to stay quiet the longest are usually the ones with the most to lose if you finally speak. So let me ask you this, because I think about it every time I plate a dish now. How long would you have stayed quiet, and how much would it have cost you before you finally said enough? If this story got to you, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my kitchen that night.